At the state level, she served in senior positions in Massachusetts under 5 governors, Democratic and Republican, including Mitt Romney. Also at the state level, she was the commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection. Currently, she is a professor at the Harvard School of Public Health, where she directs the Center for Health and the Global Environment. Now, while many people know Gina from her state days and now from her Harvard days, I think most people in this country know her from her federal days, and in particular, her work in the Obama administration. She was at EPA for the whole Obama administration. First, as the assistant administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation, which is, in my world, the office that produces all of the important rules. And then as administrator, which is a position that supervises all of these important rules, the production of all these important rules. And her accomplishments are extraordinary. When you think of the big rules in the history of this country that produce the greatest benefits, these are rules that came out of Gina's tenure at EPA. The mercury and air toxic standards avoids about 10,000 premature deaths a year. The auto standards, the changes to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, then all of the efforts to control greenhouse gas emissions, starting with cars, stationary sources, most importantly, the Clean Power Plan, also the rule limiting methane emissions for new oil and gas installations, the EPA rule as opposed to the BLM rule that we were talking about earlier. So it was during Gina's tenure at EPA that our country took a serious and structured approach to controlling greenhouse gas emissions. So on the conventional pollutant front, she has saved, during these years, literally hundreds of thousands of lives. There are very few people who have saved this number of lives. And also, she put in place a regulatory mechanism that allowed us to deal intelligently with greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I'm sure this will come up later. Very sadly, some, but by no means all, of Gina's legacy is being imperiled by this administration. A lot of it is chugging along just fine, continuing to save lives. And some of the imperiled legacy, I'm confident, will reassert itself once the efforts of the current administration are struck down by the courts, as the initial efforts to stay, delay, and suspend regulations essentially have all been struck down by the courts. And I'm, understanding the analysis that has gone into the current efforts to repeal rules, I'm confident that they will suffer the same fate. And one of the reasons is because the analysis behind the EPA rules during Gina's tenure was so extraordinary. Not that it was easy to read, like if you are tired one of these nights, you could read all 1,600 pages supporting the Clean Power Plan, and that doesn't even begin to include all of the relevant documents, the RIA, the legal justification, all these other things. You can read thousands and thousands of pages, but in these thousands of pages, there is excellent analysis. And I suspect that one of the reasons this administration is going to have such difficulties is because it's very hard to undo things that cost so much good to the American people. And for that, we owe Gina an enormous debt of gratitude. And I'm delighted that she is here to give our keynote address at the end of this conference. Thank you so much.
That's way too taller, I'm way too short. Hey, I read those rules to my new grandson, and he falls asleep right away. I knew they would come in handy at some point. Well, first of all, let me congratulate the Institute for Policy Integrity on your 10th birthday, which is very nice. That is about the year that my 3 children got really obnoxious, so I'm hoping you do the same, because there is a lot to get obnoxious about. And it's great to see so many of my colleagues from the administration continuing to be out there and be vocal and be positive about the work that we can continue to do together, even when it gets a little bit more difficult, I think, every day. Yesterday was certainly not an exception. And so it is amazing what a difference a couple of years makes. In an election, I think, might have had something to do with it as well. But it's great to see you here. And I really hope, amidst all of the discussion, that people got a chance to thank Ricky for all of his work and his team's work. It really is extraordinary. It's work that's not just looking at how we can support really good rulemaking, no matter who does it, in a way that is going to be legally sound, and when it's not, to challenge it. But it's also, there's an expertise here that I am finding more and more interesting and important, which is looking just below that analysis at how you do the economic work of the agency and look at benefit cost analysis. It's become a tremendously important point, and there is expertise here that many don't focus on. And I will tell you, it's very hard to get people excited about cost-benefit analysis. You know, you tell them the CPP's in danger. Whoa! Let's march in the streets. You know, you tell them they're not looking at co-benefits. It's like, huh? So we need people who actually do that, because frankly, the courts look at those things, because there's rules of the road that everyone has to follow, like it or not. So I really want to thank you for being an incredibly strong voice. And I know you have to be proud that you have so many students here, and students that have gone to EPA and done such terrific work. So thank you for all that. And Lord knows we are going to need you in the courts as we move forward, because I'm not really looking at Congress as being the backstop for sanity these days. But I do have to take one little exception, and that is the name of this conference. You know, I'm not a lawyer, but when you say that you're on a quest for rationality, that really is implying that you see none today. And I just think that's very cynical. I really do. Like, we don't have rational thinking today. What was yesterday all about, folks? Was that not the height of rationality? Don't you think? I mean, seriously, the administration is so cool because they're using really old, ancient laws to make sure that the federal government can mess up regional energy markets and force consumers to pay more money for dirty fuel that's making them sick. How cool is that? I mean, it's so explicable, it's hard to explain. You know, they're taking climate science off the web page. They're actually pulling or intending to pull out of Paris. They're telling the agencies that they can't consider climate impacts when they're looking at infrastructure projects. Listen, we just have to wait until we see some climate impacts, and that's going to change. But until we do, we're all set, right? I mean, Puerto Rico, nothing happened there. It was a handful of people that probably got lost in the storm, right? I mean, these are issues that we all know are really hard to judge because they're so far away and they're about everybody else, not us, right? And we can't fix them, for crying out loud. And really, this co-benefit issue is just so annoying. Why would anyone want to think about co-benefits of reducing carbon pollution when it's all these conventional pollutants that come along with it? That's not the point. Count what we're doing, don't count everything else that comes along with it. So there's all these things happening, and I just don't understand why you're cynical, because if I were running this, that would be exactly what I did. And really, this whole thing about who gets to be a scientist and who gets this stuff done, if you've ever seen, and now I see it, how much universities pay their scientists, a $25,000 STAR grant would buy me off for my entire lifetime. No wonder why they don't want those damn scientists on those panels. You know, we could just go on and on, but honestly, this is how I technically refer to the days that we're living in today. They are a technical term, they're crazy ass. Every day I turn on the TV or pick up or open up the Times or something, and I say, oh my God, please don't let anything be in there. I don't want any news of any kind. And I wake up every morning to my husband listening to MSNBC, and he's obsessed. I will tell you that. He's obsessed with this. And I wake up every morning and he's screaming and yelling. And I wake up, I'm like, what? Oh, look at the tweet. So I tell them, oh, dear God. And I sit down and I say, Ken, I love you very much. Just shut up. I have to start my day in some other way, or I'm not going to get through it. And that is sort of my message to you guys. It is crazy ass, but we will get through it. We have to get through it. There is no choice. No choice whatsoever. And I think, I'm going to just paraphrase a little bit about what Ricky said in the introduction. We did do a lot of rules. One of the reasons why we did a lot of rules was the prior 8 years they didn't do anything in the courts, or they did things that weren't legal. And the courts basically set us on these impossible deadlines, and like good doobies, we did our jobs. But we didn't just do our jobs, we actually did the job that you would want government to do. We actually did the kind of outreach that you would want government to do. Because everybody that I worked with, and I had some of the best teams imaginable, some of them are sitting in this room. I'm missing Janet and Joe, who are my comrades in arms, and they always will be. But we took extraordinary measures because we firmly believe that a democracy is of, by, and for the people. We would never have sat inside EPA and made fundamental decisions about what to do with the mission of that agency, how we would follow the law in science, unless we talked to the experts inside, listened to it, digested it, try to find a reasonable, cost-effective path forward, and then go out and test it. And we didn't test it internally, we tested it in every community who would welcome us there. We tested it in the industries that would be the regulated entity, so we wouldn't screw it up. Because you can if you don't do that kind of outreach. And I'm incredibly proud of the work that we did. And I'm proud of Ricky and his team for the defense of those rules, because they deserve to be defended. And the DC Circuit deserves a ruling on the Clean Power Plan. So if you mind just telling them that over and over again. Because one of the biggest challenges that I think we face today is not whether or not we did a good job, but the fact that every single rule is being projected or proposed to be rolled back. Not just rules that we did, but rules that have been standing for many administrations that are fundamental, not just on carbon pollution, but on traditional and conventional pollutants. And these kind of rules matter. The new rules on carbon pollution matter because if you can't do a final rule and expect that barring, after you go through all the court machinations and it's sitting there, you better damn well have a good reason other than to say I don't like it, to repropose and get rid of it. That's what we do in the United States because it sets a path forward for industry and others that have to be more certain than throwing things up and seeing how they land. That's not how we do business. And frankly, the challenge we face today is they're looking at these rules and sucking it up, knowing that they really can't get rid of them in their standard form because we did it right. We followed the science, we gave a normal interpretation of the law and followed the mission of the agency, and they don't like it, so instead of attacking just the rules, they are attacking the underlying science. They are attacking the way that cost-benefit is done and trying to change all those standard rules of practice that have been around forever. And frankly, when Reagan in 1981 decided that every new rule needed a cost-benefit analysis, I thought that that was the road to hell paved with bad intentions. I still do sometimes. However, These are rules of the road, and you damn well better follow them. And if you don't, you're going to have people like this who challenge it in the courts, and you're going down. That's it. So my most important message before we sit down and chat is that you cannot ever be like my husband. You cannot get down. As bad as yesterday was, you got to pull yourself up in the morning, you got to look around, you got to remember that yes, the CPP's in limbo, but guess what? Clean energy has taken off in it. It ain't changing. And no matter what ancient law you put out of your head, sorry, I almost said the wrong word, pull out of your hat, or the other end, it's not going to change. Because we have made progress and we are not ever going back. So stand tall, stand together. Turn the chaos of this democracy into a reason why every single one of us has to stop being complacent and get up and march. Because if that's what it takes, that's what we did in the 60s, that's what we did in the 70s. So all you young people, buy bell-bottoms, wear mattress shirts, get out. Information is still power. That's what we have to bring to the table. Thank you very much.
That was great.
I think maybe I've had too much coffee. You know what I say to that? Get over it. All right.
So Gina, to underscore what a great job you had done on these rules, the proposed replacement of the Clean Power Plan has an economic analysis, and the economic analysis shows that it would cause massive net harms to the American people. In some ways, you have to give them some credit for candor. And even though they're understating the harms because of various shenanigans they use, they still actually acknowledge those harms. And the other thing they do, interestingly, is they say that EPA is in part at least exercising its discretion to pick this. They also say in part that it's compelled by law, but they want to say that it's an exercise of EPA's discretion because they want to get the benefit of Chevron deference. Mm-hmm. So we have a situation where EPA is exercising its discretion to cause massive harms, massive net harms. They don't have any sort of countervailing benefit to the American people. 1,000 or more lives lost a year.
Other than that, it's PISA, right?
Right, but the question, but here's a question. Maybe you can give advice to this group, because many of us are actually trying to communicate this. Yeah. And I'm not sure that we're doing as effective a job as could be done, because it just strikes me as such an incredibly outrageous thing. So can you guide us on how to tell the story about the totally extraordinary action of the government saying we're taking this discretionary action in order to create great net harms to the American people? How do we tell that story?
God only knows. Loudly. I think one of the big challenges that we have, and this stems from work that I'm trying to do at Harvard, is that I think we do a terrible job telling our story. We've done a terrible job on climate change, because people understand it's happening, and in places like Puerto Rico, there is no joke. Human lives have been lost, and that's not clearly the only place in the United States, if we think about North Carolina and South Carolina as well. But I don't think we tell a very good story. I don't think we explain health consequences of issues in ways that people relate to. And I don't think we are supporting grassroots organizations the way that we need to. In my world, everything starts locally. I tell people, climate change is carbon pollution. I don't ever want to call it climate change, although that's what people call it, because it's just pollution. And we've done a pretty damn good job on pollution. But pollution always goes down to the lowest levels. It holds people down. Those people are always the kids, the elderly, minorities, and low income. That's the people that are being held down. We never make that equity case, ever. And it is an equity issue, believe me, and CPP is an equity issue without question, and we tried to cleverly make sure that everybody would have access to the clean energy responses. And we just need to, I think, continue to remember that because pollution goes down to the lowest levels, that's where actions happen that spur change coming up. So everybody, the young people at Harvard are all like flipping out about what's going on at the federal level. And I try to remind them that we look so good because we did something when the prior 8 years they did nothing. So if you think that the federal government is the only actor who can make a change in the world, it's not true. And right now you are seeing cities and states stepping up. What we really need to do is to make sure that we're giving people the information they need to demand in a democracy what they can get. We will never get this administration to care that this new ACE or whatever it's called, the Ace Ventura thing, they'll never care or be upset about the fact that they are proposing directly opposite of the mission of the agency. They are proposing not to protect public health and the environment in a way that's more expensive. So it's an interesting debate, but I don't think we're ever going to change that except through the courts. I just don't think it's going to happen. And so I would much prefer that people actually go out and talk to normal human beings, actually support grassroots organizations, because you will continue to drive change in the local level and in cities and towns, and you'll drive change in the voting booths. That's where change is most necessary.
You know, we live in a very polarized society, and the political parties are very far apart these days, and they believe in different science and different facts and different economics. Now, you are rare among high-ranking public officials that you actually worked with administrations of both parties. Do you have advice on how one can engage Republicans on these kinds of issues?
Well, I think the first thing I would admit to you is that the Republicans I worked for were in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and they look a little bit like moderate Democrats. But honestly, it's the same way as I worked with industry. You've got to understand what people care about. You've got to connect at a gut level. I don't know of any Republican that would have failed to pick up the phone and call me if they had a health problem in their own community. And I would remind them of that. You know, there are consequences to defunding EPA, and one is that, we're not going to be there when you need us. And so you've got to try to remind them what you do for a living, not the rhetoric that's talked about. And you've got to remind them of all the resources that the federal government provides to their communities and why they would want to continue to support this. This partisanship that has all started, not just about EPA, because EPA is often we're often browbeaten by both sides. I mean, that's just the way it works, and it's not great. But I think climate has upped the ante significantly, because climate change has become a stated, position of both parties. You have to believe it on one side, and you can't believe it on the other, and it's outrageous. And I'm not sure that anything other than changes in administration will take care of that.
This came up in one of the earlier panels, and it's an issue that I'm actually focusing on in an article that is about to come out. It is the case that coal miners are going to end up being worse off as a result of very necessary environmental policies. And it's kind of not their fault. On the other hand, it would be crazy to say that because of their problem, we can't take actions that are going to have these enormous net benefits to the country. But is there a way to take their plight seriously? And I know that you all did try to do that in the Obama administration. It was actually Republicans who thwarted you along the way because they I think, prefer to use coal miners as sort of a political statement than actually address the, the very real issues that were affecting them. Is there an intelligent way to deal with this so that they don't get, so the coal miners actually get some help that they probably should get and don't get used as political pawns in this like sort of broader existential debate between the parties?
I think the only way, I think, to deal with it is to recognize that, and I think it's one of the challenges we face today, is there's a lot of people who feel like they have no power and that the world is changing at a pace that they cannot keep up with. They're just being left behind, and I actually think many people are being left behind. So I think it's well beyond the coal miners. But I have to say that the way in which the folks that represent those states have behaved, I find incredibly disreputable. I have to say it, because it just really upsets me to go and try to tell people that you're going to reverse the way the economic trend is going. And that's the only way you can get elected, so you keep telling people that, when they know as well as anybody that the coal industry has been declining since the 80s, and that people have been losing their jobs. People in the mining industry are very unhealthy. There are significant challenges in those communities with poverty and opiate addiction and everything. It is time, and I think the only way to do it is to have a concerted effort to try to boost up the economies in those areas and get them into the next generation of jobs. I don't know any other way to do it. But the United States doesn't do well at that. I've asked people, do you have an example of when we've done this before? And the answer is no. The economies shift, people just shift. I will say that I spent a little bit of time when I was at the School of Public Health doing a fellowship, and Governor Beshear was there, who was the governor in Kentucky. And he was one of the first states to really jump on board of the Affordable Care Act. And he is a remarkable leader, and we spent some time talking, because one of the things that he did was to recognize that in his state it's split. You have heavy coal in one area and not in another. And he used the Affordable Care Act to build healthcare facilities and put people to work in coal country. He decided that he would direct a lot of the resources there because the state was saving so much money by jumping on board. And you need to have that kind of state and local leadership in order to define how best the federal government can actually go in and provide an intervention. But it's money, it's resources, it's retraining, and it's recognizing that communities, that you still need to protect the environment in West Virginia, just like everywhere else, because frankly, there are a lot of people who have not any clean water to drink in West Virginia, and we have to figure that out.
Turning to a different embattled group, let's move from coal miners to EPA career employees. So,
should we say who's worse off?
So this wasn't a good week.
No.
The head of the child office was put on administrative leave. The science advisor apparently is being phased out. And this is not, it wasn't that unusual a week. We sort of hear about things like this from time to time. What advice do you give? And I assume you actually, and here is hypothetical. I assume that it probably happens in real life as well. What advice do you give to some senior EPA career person who's been there for quite a long time across several administrations, if they ask you, should I try to stay through this?
Well, I had, one consistent piece of advice for them before I left, and that was to sit in the chair and keep your ass there for as long as you possibly can. I did not know that it would be as difficult as it is. Frankly, under Scott Pruitt, the disrespect for the career staff was palpable, and it was really hard to see, a handful of inexperienced folks come in and rewrite rules without the input of the career staff or with the input and ignoring it. I think that the new administrator, Wheeler, is much more respectful of the staff. Does that mean the decisions are going to come out differently? Not likely, because everybody takes that job, and I think he did, knowing what the wishes of the president were. So I think that the challenge that you're seeing now is I think the fact that President Trump had proposed some changes to be able to quickly fire and get rid of a number of career staff. When that failed and the courts wouldn't allow those changes, the labor unions challenged them. I think what you're seeing now is reorganization in the regions and in headquarters, where the sole purpose is to get rid of jobs that career employers are in so that they can shift them somewhere else where they know they won't go. And that way you can start, whittling down the staff. So I'm not any longer giving them advice because, first of all, I'm not spending my time talking to them because it probably wouldn't be great for their longevity. But in addition, they're going to have to make their own decisions. I think many of the staff who were retirement age have left, but there are many, many more that are staying. And I think they're going to try to continue to do their jobs effectively.
Now, moving from the depressing to the more optimistic, so let's assume that...
How about those Red Sox? Is that what you're talking about? I love to talk about the Red Sox in New York City.
So let's assume that...
Celtics are going to be great. I'm sorry. Patriots, let's not have that conversation. I'm sorry.
No. Anything that makes us feel good is great.
Drinks. Oh no.
Yeah, that'll be in a few minutes. So let's assume that we, after the 2020 election, we are planning a very different kind of transition.
Yep.
A transition to an administration that would want to put in place good and rational policies together, and obviously the transition will be complicated because of what this administration did, but also it presumably won't be the case that the goal should be to put back in place every single policy of the administration in an identical form, and the goal should be somewhat different. So let's sort of stick to climate change for starters, and for now let's stick to the EPA responsibilities. We can talk about legislation in a minute. How should we think about how to put a rational climate change policy together for an administration that's interested in that, that may not be identical to what the Obama administration did, because time passed, things on the ground changed, and all these other things happened?
Yeah, I think, there are a lot of efforts already underway, none of which I'm participating in, on what to do next. How do we get prepared for a potential shift that allows a more rational approach to life. And I think people are doing exactly as you suggest, which is it's not about going back and forgetting that time has passed. I mean, we all know that the CPP could be much tougher next time around because we've gone way past where we ever anticipated we were going to be in 2022. So you can't rely on the old analysis. And so I think we have the new administration is going to have a job to do. But, Ricky, I want to mention something to you, and it really keeps me up sometimes thinking about it. And the thing that bothers me the most is that I really worry if we don't get out of the partisanship where the environment is concerned, that nothing will ever be done. I never thought I'd worry about the rule of law in the United States of America, and I do worry about it. Because if all it is I do a final rule, and suppose you sort of said to yourself, if you were a utility and you didn't want to do anything, or you wanted to get out of things you were told you had to do, what if I decided, okay, a scrubber costs $500,000, or $million, $300 million. What if I decided to spend half of that on elections instead of my scrubber, so that I could make sure that the next administration would undo what we did? And you do that again the next time. I'm enormously worried about that ping pong effect. We have never in our history had final rules questioned the way that we have it now. And I just think it would be a serious mistake if the next administration comes in and just ping pongs again. You're going to have a much more strategic approach than every rule coming back. And I don't know what that is, but I also don't think they're particularly going to go away as much as they're going to be in limbo while it goes through the courts. So I worry about that a lot. I don't know if anybody else does, but when we did a lot of international work, and for the vast majority of the decades of EPA, we would send technical staff to other countries to help them look at the science and understand technology and what's available. When I was there as administrator, the vast majority of work that we did with international countries is to send lawyers. We actually wanted to get rid of them because they're pains in, no, I'm only kidding. Because the issue is that with everybody's great intent, everything is lovely, but if you don't have a rule of law, nothing else matters. It's enforcement, it's compliance. Look at how the agency has whittled itself down with absolutely no ability to have an enforcement presence. These are fundamental problems that we're going to have to fix. So it's not just the rules themselves. It's the entire basis upon which we had progress at EPA that needs to be rebuilt. And it's not going to be done in a day. And the reputation of the United States will not recover from this administration internationally for a very long time. That's depressing. You said we wanted to get at something good.
Yeah.
How about those Red Sox?
By the way, if you have questions, I will stop asking a minute and turn over to the cards. So pass cards around, and I will then read them. Turning from EPA to Congress, 4 years ago when we had our policy integrity conference, Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island gave a keynote address, and he said that he actually was optimistic. This was before the 2014 midterm election, that an economy-wide carbon tax, a zero net revenue carbon tax could pass. And he said that there were at least half a dozen Republican senators who had told him privately that at the appropriate moment they would come up and support it. Now, at that point, there were 54 Democratic senators. A few weeks after Senator Whitehouse's speech, a lot of the Democratic senators lost their seats, so at this point, 6 wouldn't do the trick, and it would take a lot more, and so on. Do you see some scenario where there can be some agreement with Democrats and some Republicans to say, look, this sort of like sector by sector regulation is cumbersome and is difficult and so on, and you might not be able to do some trades that are desirable, and some sort of legislative solution could work better and could, is that sort of just totally fanciful thinking, or should we be thinking about that in connection with the next presidential transition?
Yeah, I do think we should be thinking about that. I am much less pessimistic than I was before. I think underneath all of the drama, that there's a lot of Republicans who actually understand that climate change is happening. They understand the risks. I think the business community underneath it all is speaking more loudly than they have before about the international and the domestic risks that they face. When I'm at Harvard hanging around with the young people, they're all awesome because they get the social justice issues, which I think should be big drivers of change. But they're a little bit short-sighted in terms of understanding that life does change, and it can change very dramatically. Just as it did in the last election, it could change dramatically. And I never could have predicted that Governor Scott would ever sign a gun control law. Now, you never want to have that kind of disaster be the precipitating factor, but things change. And I am pretty confident that there will be an opportunity for congressional action. Now, the drama that I have when I talk to people is that I love this idea of a cap and dividend. I mean, that seems to be very appealing to the Republicans who are pushing for it. The challenge with a cap and dividend is that it neglects to recognize that there are some things that where public sector dollars are going to be essential to move. And I think transportation, which is the greatest, now the largest sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it is going to take a lot of public dollars and a lot of discussion among the public. It's not going to be done by the fanciful wishes of one guy who owns an EV technology. It's going to have to be a lot more work to understand. And so you can't do tax and dividend for everything. You're going to have to figure out the sectors and how you address these issues.
So some questions that I've been handed. Why are industry, real utility partnerships and cooperation so difficult to forge? And how can we do better in this regard?
Well, the one thing that's interesting right now is that even the private sector is not being listened to by this administration. You have to understand that. I mean, they're just proposing things, and if they do it terribly and it loses in court, then they'll complain that it was those leftist judges, and it wasn't really the fact that they didn't do their job. If you look at it right now, you've got EEI, the Edison Electric Institute, writing to the administrator at EPA to tell them, do not rethink the mercury and air toxic standard. They will, and they are, and they've already said so. So you can forge relationships. I think industries, you may not be able to do it in a public fashion, but we had tremendous amounts of very deep discussions with the utility industry because they knew stuff that we didn't. And if we just treated them as public enemy number one, we never would have been clever enough to get the work done. And they trusted that we could have those discussions in a way where we met their reasonable needs, but also did our jobs. And so I kind of like a lot of the utility guys. I know what makes them tick. I know what world they live in. I know their world can get better. I now know that they love renewable energy and energy efficiency, and they're investing it no matter what the administration or the rules say. So I think there are real opportunities. Big industry now is going to be a big challenge because that is going to end up being the need for huge investment in sectors that have very little margin. Utilities are easier because whatever they end up paying, they suck back from us.
Right. Thank you. So another question from the audience. As much as was done during your time at EPA, looking back, do you feel you should have gone much further, especially in light of what followed?
No. I understood the question, and we did, there were some things that we could have tried to do more quickly in the end. That is not my style, I have to tell you. I think you should do things in the most deliberate way and the best way you can. I think when you cut corners, you do an injustice to the process. And I'm pretty much a public servant freak. That's who I work for, and I never felt like we should cut corners and do something that was blatantly just all about getting something on the table. But there's always things that you wish you could have done differently and better, things that are left over. But that's part of what you do in public service. You do the best you can with the time you have.
So, just following up on that. If the climate rules had been done in President Obama's first term, we'd probably be in a different place now because they wouldn't have been, the challenges wouldn't have been pending in the courts, so these abeyances wouldn't have been possible. Many of them would have gone into effect and investments have been made and so on. And I understand sort of why that didn't happen, but looking back on it.
Yeah, it's Carol Browner's fault without question. No, I'm just kidding. Is Carol here? Sorry, I was just kidding, Carol.
If you had been asked during the first term, would you have, in retrospect, suggested that they move more quickly with these rules?
Probably not, because if you remember, there was every reason to believe, and we only lost by 2 damn votes about getting a cap and trade bill through Congress. There was every reason to believe that we had a big shot at that. And while I love rules, a congressional response to this would have been a much deeper and more effective tool at that point in time. It would have, if it had been done right, it would have taken a lot of the drama out that grew as we were looking at doing rulemaking. So I think it was the right thing to do. It didn't work. And that's as much as I can say.
Okay. Changing gears, different question from the audience. How can we use the outreach and collaboration with communities that was done in your administration to create a receptivity for the renewed regulation in the next administration?
Yeah. I think that's where the name of the game is right now. The name of the game and I've received calls by people who have lots of money about what they should do with, on the climate issues, and mayors who want to do the right thing, and I tell them, fund grassroots organizations, because they happen to be voters that can instigate an accountability mechanism that the rest of us from outside can't. And so I think that is what has to happen. I decided that when I left the administration, I tried to think about what I was going to do. And one of the things I decided was to go back to the public health world where I really came from, because EPA is a public health agency. That's sort of the name of the game. And when I went there, I did purposely knowing that if you want to make progress on climate, you have to talk about health. That's the name of the game. And everything you do to make the world healthier is going to also make the planet healthier. And I'm happy to not argue about climate if we're doing the right thing. Now, I'm not going to ignore it, but I'm going to try to drive change. And I started thinking about it, and everything, honestly, that we've ever made in terms of progress at EPA has been based on making the health consequences clear, and it's been based on having already been tried and true and data collected on why the systems we were relying on work at the local level and at the state level and often at the regional level. So I don't think that really creative new things come out of the federal government as much as it's driven from the bottom up. And I am not going, you're dealing with, people get so frustrated we haven't made any progress on climate. We've been burning fossil fuels since primitive people have been on this earth. Give me a little break here. Let's not get discouraged. Let's realize that we are now at a time where technology evolves in moments. And there will be solutions to this. But we have to continue to broaden and motivate people. And I don't know a better way than to aggravate the hell out of local leaders by supporting grassroots organizations that get this and make demands. That's how it works, at least in my world.
So moving from the local to the international, so the question from the audience. I guess it was a time when other countries looked to the US for leadership and for guidance. Yeah. So now, are there countries that you think have particularly good policies in place with respect to climate change that we should be looking at for examples?
Yeah, everybody knows the folks who do the best, but the most interesting ones that I am looking at is, I think both in the EU and in China, they are beginning to realize that certainly in the EU, they're losing ground. They're not making the progress that they want. There's some work being contemplated in Paris that's really interesting on the transportation sector. But I love the idea that they're going to ban the internal combustion engine in 2040. I think that's fabulous. That is the kind of thing that instigates change, that moves technology forward. I love it. I just think it's exactly the kind of signal that we should be sending, is that there's going to be a timeout, folks. And you got to make a big change. And I think that sends a long-term signal that we actually tried to send in the Clean Power Plan, that that's not happening now. Now in China, I think they're doing some remarkable things and some things that I'd like things to be done differently. And India is beginning to sort of take some action on the solar side. There's a lot of anxiety about, the choices that they're making. But I have a hard time if people are getting healthier to not think that that's a good thing, because demand then increases, voices get heard that weren't heard before, and change continues to move forward. So good things are happening. I did a meeting yesterday that the UAE asked me to moderate, which was a panel of about 30 ministers of health from a variety of different countries, just talking about what can we do and what can be done. And it's just embarrassing to be at moderating that, knowing that the US isn't sitting at the table. So I pretended that I totally represented. Just kidding. No, I told them we had to get off our ass. I was really sorry. It's about the best I could say. But it was remarkable. I mean, it was fun. It was engaging. And I think people need to understand, honestly, that the air pollution issue is so extreme in many of these countries that it's becoming blatantly in their face that climate change is a really big problem. And it's not just air pollution, clearly, but that's why China's in the game. That's why India is beginning to move. It's not because we've been so thoroughly great at explaining climate change. And China's recognized that there is tremendous economic benefit to them to actually make change and to invest in cleaner technology that they then bring into the US and kick our butts. And I just that used to be us.
So there are a number of very good questions here, but we have time for only one more. And as a last question for Gina and for the conference, I kind of like this one. I think it was meant as a serious question. I'm not 100% certain, but I'm going to ask it. So the question says, Gina, why don't you tell us how you really feel?
Oh, that's a good one. I know that I'm just the epitome of discretion. I am so nuanced in what I say. Just a few things. The institute here is incredibly important to keep a check even on the Obama administration, what we were doing. This is government at its best when you have folks that are clever and resourceful, and you have young people involved in learning. But a democracy really, we're in the middle of a democratic tussle. If we let go of that rope, the other side wins. I come from a big Irish family, and I come from Boston. We don't give up. We just get mad. And we just keep pushing harder. And so at this point in time, this is just a struggle. And we have to stay in the game, and things will get better. And every morning it is hard to get up sometimes, but then I go in and I hang out with young people, and you realize that it's their world next, and they're coming up. And they're going to demand things that we were never able to achieve, and we'll do okay. So that is honestly how I feel. I'm proud of what I've done in public service. I'm proud to be able to keep supporting these efforts, and I'm still proud to live in the United States of America. That's it. Okay.
Thank you, Gina. That was spectacular. So I just want to give a huge thanks to Gina. This was really a spectacular keynote address. And also want to thank her for the enormous benefit she conveyed to the American people during her tenure at EPA. It's extraordinary. When I said in my introduction that I regard Gina as one of our nation's most distinguished public servants, I really mean that, and I think you can see today why that is. So thank you so much
Ricky, you too.
for being with us.
Thank you.